Welcome back to the listener's commentary on the Gospel of Matthew. In this recording, we're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 24, verses 32 through 51. And we're right in the middle of Jesus' final climactic teaching in Matthew's Gospel. Recall that Matthew has 5 large teaching blocks around which he arranges his narrative of Jesus' life. And this is the 5th one. It began in chapter 23, it continues on into chapter 25, and we're here in this recording right at the end of chapter 24. And to make sure we don't miss what Jesus is talking about, the disciples had asked Jesus when the temple was going to be destroyed and when his parousia, his appearing or his coming would be. And those 2 questions set the direction for how chapter 24 is laid out and what chapter 24 is all about. So, chapter 24, verses 4 through 35, in response to those questions, those verses are primarily about the destruction of the temple that happened in the year 70 AD. And then beginning in chapter 24, verse 36 and following, that's about the return of Jesus. We actually see a bit of a contrast between verses 32 through 35 and verses 36 and following. In verses 32 through 35, it tells us that there are signs to tip you off when Jerusalem is about to be destroyed. There's signs for that one, so pay attention. But verse 36 and following, it says, about the coming of Christ, about the return of Jesus, there are no signs. No one knows. So at the end of our last recording, we read verses 32 through 35, but I want to include it again here with a little bit more comment so we don't miss the connection and the contrast between how Jesus speaks in 32 through 35 and then how he speaks in 36 and following. And so as the conclusion to his teaching and prediction about the destruction of the temple, Jesus says in verse 32, "Now, learn the parable from the fig tree. As soon as its branch has become tender and it sprouts leaves, you know that summer is near." That's the image in this illustration or this parable that Jesus is going to give. It is about the beginnings of summer evidenced by fig trees becoming tender and sprouting leaves. Very familiar image. This was well known. Fig trees were everywhere, and it signifies that summer's almost there. Then you get the point of comparison in verse 33. It says this, "So you too." So learn about the fig tree. "So you too, when you see all these things." What are all these things? Well, it's the things he just finished talking about that we looked at in our last recording. It's the things that signify or evidence that Jerusalem is about to be attacked, the temple destroyed. What are the signs? Well, it's things like the signs of siege, buildup of troops, false messiahs, and all that. When you see those kinds of things, recognize, verse 33 continues to say, recognize that he is near right at the door. Now, let me just suggest, I think we could translate that a little bit better. Recognize not that he is near, but that it is near. In Greek, the same ending on that word translated he could either be translated he or it could be translated it. What's he talking about? He's talking about an it. He's talking about the destruction of the temple. He's answering a question about that. And so what he's actually saying is, just like the fig tree signals summer is near, the buildup of troops, the arrival of false messiahs, and all those sorts of signs signify or signal that it is near, that the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple is near. And it's obvious that he's still talking about the destruction of the temple because of what he says next in verses 34 and 35. Look at those verses. He says, "Truly I say to you, this generation," that is the generation he's talking to, the day and age he's living in, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. In other words, it's going to happen in the days of that generation. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Jesus' point there in verses 34 and 35 is he's guaranteeing that the prediction of the destruction of the city and the destruction of the temple, that it's going to happen during the lifetime of that current generation. And Jesus actually said throughout the Gospel of Matthew a number of times things about this generation. He's talked about how a false and adulterous generation loves to seek for a sign. He's talked about how this generation no sign will be given to it except for the sign of Jonah. And actually, in the preceding chapter here, in verse 23, still part of this teaching, Jesus actually uses this very same phrase to indicate that he's talking about the people of his day. In chapter 23, he gave all these woes upon the scribes and the Pharisees. And then in that context, he actually said that all of these things are going to come upon this generation. That all these woes, all this trouble, all these problems, all this stuff is going to come upon this generation. And that's the same point he's making here. And so it's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70 AD. And the point he's making in this little illustration of the fig tree is that destruction is signaled by various visible signs, and it's going to occur in their lifetime. But as for the arrival of Jesus, as for the parousia, Jesus goes on to say in verse 36 and following, there are no signs. There's nothing that's going to signal that. No signs are going to herald that. That's going to come suddenly and surprisingly out of the blue. Look what he says in verse 36. But about that day and hour. So the previous little illustration and parable began, learn from the parable of the fig tree. As soon as you see its branches, you know that summer's near. So you too, when you see all these things, you know it's right at the door. But about that day and hour. The day and hour of Jesus' return, the day and hour of the parousia, about that day and hour, not even the angels of heaven nor the Son knows, but the Father alone knows. So only God knows exactly when that's going to happen, that Jesus, in his finitude as the incarnate Son, he doesn't even know. The angels don't know the timetable. In fact, he goes on to say in verse 37 and following, it will be like life as usual, and then out of the blue, he'll arrive. Look at verse 37. For the coming of the Son of Man, the parousia, the arrival of the Son of Man, will be just like in the days of Noah. He's going to go on and explain what he means by the days of Noah. But the point is that people were just going about their life in the days of Noah. It caught them off guard. They didn't believe Noah's preaching. They didn't think a giant flood was coming. It just came out of the blue for them. There were no signs that it was going to happen, and that's the way it's going to be when Jesus comes again. It'll be life as usual. Look at verse 38. For as in those days, the days of Noah, before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage. In other words, it was life as usual. They were just going about their normal stuff right up until the day that Noah entered the ark. And they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away. So it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. It's going to be the same way. Life is normal. Everyone's going to be going about life, and it's just going to happen unexpectedly, out of the blue. He continues with the explanation in verse 40, saying, at that time there will be 2 men out in the field. One will be taken, and one will be left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill. One will be taken, one will be left. They're going about their ordinary life. The men are going about their work out in the field. The women are going about their work, grinding grain. They're just doing what they do every day, and then they are taken away. Now, we need to reflect on what he means by taken. And the reason for that is because a popular misreading of this text has led some to think that it's the righteous who will be taken away and the wicked will be left behind. That actually ignores what Jesus just said in the illustration about Noah. That's what he's talking about. And in the illustration of Noah, in verse 39, he says, they did not understand. Who's the they? The people of Noah's day who are just going about life as usual. They didn't know until the flood came and, notice what it says, took them all away. Who's taken away by the flood in Noah's day? Well, they are. The wicked are. The unrighteous. It's Noah and his family who are left behind. The wicked are the ones that are taken away. And so we have to make sure we read verses 40 and 41 in context. It is the wicked who are taken away, who are removed out of the earth. As Jesus said in Matthew chapter 13 in his kingdom parables, the wicked are the ones that are cast aside and taken away, and what remains is Jesus' purified kingdom there in Matthew 13. And it's the same point here. And so it is the righteous that remain behind after the wicked are removed by the judgment that comes at Jesus' return. So, in view of the fact that no one knows when it's going to happen and that it's going to come suddenly out of the blue, what should Jesus' followers do? Well, here's the point. Here's what he wants us to learn, verse 42. Therefore, be on the alert, for you do not know which day your Lord is coming. That's how Jesus wants us to take this information and what he wants us to do with it. There are no signs to signify it. We don't know when it's going to happen. It's going to come unexpectedly. So what should you do? Since you don't know when it's going to happen, what you should do is you should be on the alert. You should be ready at all times. And then Jesus uses a simple analogy. He says, be sure of this, that if the head of the house had known at what time of night the thief was coming, he would have been on the alert and would not have allowed his house to be broken into. Notice the connection with the preceding. This little illustration or analogy is about being on the alert. If he had known, he would have been on the alert at that exact time. He would have set up his alarm. He would have got up. Okay, the thief is coming at 2:43, and he would have been ready to go. But since he doesn't know when it's going to happen, you're going to have to be on the alert at all times. And it's this analogy from Jesus' teaching where the idea of a thief in the night comes from. And the apostles took this little imagery, this analogy from Jesus, and took that phrase then that it's going to happen like a thief or like a thief in a night. We see that in 1 Thessalonians 5, verses 1 and following. We see it in 2 Peter chapter 3. Well, they got that idea of Jesus coming unexpectedly as a surprise from Jesus' own words here in this chapter. And so Jesus tells us in verse 44, because of this, for this reason, he says, because it's going to be unexpected, because it's going to be a surprise, for this reason, you must be ready as well. You have to be on the alert and ready at any moment, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour when you do not think he will. There's no signs to signal it. You don't know when it's going to happen. And so you need to be on the alert, ready and prepared. And he's going to actually illustrate this idea of being alert and prepared with 3 illustrations. The first we get here at the end of chapter 24, and then 2 more illustrations on into chapter 25. And the first illustration here is about a servant who's responsible for looking after and feeding all of the other household servants in a house. So here's the illustration that he gives us here at the end of chapter 24. He says in verse 45, "Who then is the faithful and sensible servant or slave whom his master put in charge of all his household servants to give them their food at the proper time?" So we've set up the topic of the illustration. It is about a servant who is responsible for giving food to all the other servants in the house, and Jesus wants to know what kind of servant is faithful and responsible, faithful and prudent, faithful and wise. And as the story will unfold, we learn that the master has gone away and he's trusted his servants with various responsibilities in managing the estate. And this particular servant, he's in charge of overseeing all the other servants. So if he's been faithful to his task while his master is gone, then look what happens when his master returns. Blessed is that servant, that slave, whom his master finds so doing when he comes. So he's entrusted the care of all his servants to this particular servant. And when his master returns from his trip, if he has been responsible and faithful in carrying out his task, then he's blessed by his master. Truly, verse 47 says, "Truly I say to you that he will put him in charge of all his possessions." He gave him this task of making sure all the servants are well fed. He was faithful and good at his task. And so when the master returns, he's going to entrust him with greater responsibility. But, verse 48, If that slave is evil and says in his heart, "My master's not coming for a long time," and begins to beat his fellow slaves, and he eats and drinks with those habitually drunk, then the master of that slave will come on a day that he does not expect, at an hour that he does not know, and he will cut him in two and assign him to a place with the hypocrites. And in that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So notice what happens on the flip side. If he's faithful, then he's going to be given more responsibility. But if he's evil and unfaithful and self-serving, and it's like, my master's not going to be here forever, I can do whatever I want, and then all of a sudden the master shows up unexpectedly out of the blue, and there are harsh consequences for his faithlessness and for his mistreating the master's servants. And that's the call to action. We need to be ready and alert and prepared, carrying out the master's will while he's away, because he could come at any moment. And so, whereas Jesus says that there are noteworthy signs of the temple's destruction, and to flee Jerusalem when one sees them. That's what he said in chapter 24, right? To flee Jerusalem when he sees them. About his coming, however, there are no signs, and no one knows when it's going to happen except the Father. And we today still need to pay attention to this. We need to pay attention to it because there are still people who try to figure out the signs of Jesus' return, even though Jesus says quite clearly there are no signs and it's going to come unexpectedly. So we need to pay attention to what Jesus says here so that we can follow his instructions about being ready and prepared for his coming, because it could happen any day. Whatever day you're listening to this could be the day. Tomorrow morning could be the day. Every day we wake up, we're a day closer, and we don't know exactly when it's going to happen. We just know that it will happen, and it could happen at any moment, any day. And therefore, as Jesus says, we must be watching, alert, and we must be ready and prepared. And we do that by carrying out the Master's will on his behalf while he's away. All right, thanks for tuning in to this session on the Listener's Commentary on the New Testament. The Listener's Commentary is a listener-supported, crowd-funded Bible teaching ministry that's only possible because of the generosity of all sorts of folks just like you. So thanks a ton for your support. And if you want to join the team of supporters, easiest way to do that is to go to listenerscommentary.com. Click the Give button. There's a link down below as well in the show notes. You can click the link down below there. It'll redirect you to a page, my page with World Family Mission, where you can set up a one-time gift or a recurring monthly donation by checking that box that says make this donation monthly. So thanks a ton for your support. Your donations all come my way and help this ministry continue to exist and continue to flourish and thrive so that people can study the scriptures and learn and follow Jesus through this means. Thanks a ton for your support.